Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2% Better Health podcast. I am your host, Carrie Bennett. Today, I'm going to be doing a solo episode. I wanted to take a deep dive into the world of nitric oxide, which has been described as a miracle molecule, but I feel like it hasn't gotten enough attention. And perhaps we only understand it in light of we know that it's heart healthy. And even then, I think we need to dive into it a little bit deeper and try to understand it more. So today, I wanted to share with you the many roles of the different types of nitric oxide in the body, the fact that some of them you want to increase, some of them you want to decrease, and how and why and where. So it has like this Goldilocks effect. And I want you to really understand that nitric oxide has a purpose, but you want just the right amount for the optimum health of your body. And then this is going to highlight nitric oxide in the brain, in the cardiovascular system, its use in the mitochondria, the immune system, and then how this all ties together to two of my favorite concepts, which are both sunlight and exclusion zone water, that easy water. If you're not familiar with easy water, I encourage you to listen to two of my previous podcasts that I've done. One I did just, again, as a solo episode, and in another one, I got to interview Dr. Gerald Pollack, who really has driven home the research behind exclusion zone water. But I'll touch on that a little bit today. And then also, I want to finish this off by sharing with you so many ways in which you can optimize nitric oxide function in the body. I'm going to try something different. I teach college classes, and when I teach college classes, they've been on Zoom, and I typically do a PowerPoint presentation. So for those of you who are just listening to this on either Spotify or Anchor or one of the other podcast streaming platforms, you may want to tune into the video on YouTube, because on YouTube, I will be sharing some images, some graphs from various research articles that I've found that I think might be beneficial in explaining this whole nitric oxide and why it is this miracle molecule and what we can do to optimize it. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen here and we can go. I will try to, even though I know that there are slides present that you can watch on YouTube, I will try to describe it with my words as much as possible as well for those of you who are just listening to it. So I have titled this particular podcast, Nitric Oxide, a super important but seemingly forgotten player in optimum health and longevity. And then, of course, I want to add those 2% practical tips to improve nitric oxide status in the body. So here's nitric oxide, right? Nitric oxide is simply nitrogen and oxygen. And its history is fairly recent. Well, let me correct that. It's gone back a long. There are references to a gas like nitric oxide back in the 1700s. So nitric oxide is a gas, and it's a gas that's produced in the body, and it has a very short life in the body. From really give or take 2 seconds. And its life in the body, how long it can exist and live in the body, depends a lot on the presence of oxygen. So when oxygen is higher, nitric oxide can live a little bit longer and vice versa. So anyways, that being said, nitric oxide, because it only lives for a little while in the body, it serves what we would consider a signaling purpose. It like waves a little flag and it tells the body to do something. And then the body will continue on and it can initiate, signaling cascades and pathways that are either physiologically important and beneficial, or they're pathogenic. They can be damaging to the tissue, to the body. And so that's where nitric oxide is a Goldilocks molecule. It has to be just right in just the right situation. We don't always want too much and we don't always want too little. I do feel like, speaking as an American, oftentimes we hear nitric oxide is good, so a lot is great, and more is better. That's kind of the mentality, right? A little is good. If a little is good, a lot is better. But that's not always the case with nitric oxide. It is in some instances. And so I want you to kind of figure out what that means to your body as this podcast continues. So it was given this molecule is so important. It was given a Nobel Prize. I believe there were 3 researchers that were given the Nobel Prize in 1998. The researcher who I remember is Dr. Ignarro. I've listened to a couple of talks that he's given, which were very fascinating about, the discovery of nitric oxide. And its discovery was mainly highlighted in its importance in the cardiovascular system, We do know that nitric oxide plays a huge role in the health of the cardiovascular system, which includes heart health, but there's also cardiovascular system in the brain. So that's brain health as well. And so we're going to go into that a little bit. But nitric oxide plays a role in so many different areas of the body. So besides the cardiovascular health, it also plays a role in the brain, like I said, but also in neurotransmission. So it helps to improve signaling in the brain, neurotransmission signaling in the brain. I'm not going to touch a ton on that in this presentation, so I will use this slide for those of you watching to talk about that briefly. But I am going to go a little bit deeper into mitochondria and how nitric oxide can work in the mitochondria, the immune system, obviously the cardiovascular system, and then its tie to sunlight and exclusion zone water. So before I get off of this, the brain aspect of it, I want to highlight the fact that there are 3 different types of enzymes that make nitric oxide. And remember, an enzyme is simply a molecule, a protein that helps facilitate something to happen in the body. It can speed it up, it can make it easier, it facilitates something to happen. So don't get bogged down by the words, but just make note there's 3 enzymes that actually make nitric oxide. One of them is the old school classifications were INOS, ENOS, and NOS. And NOS is just capital NOS, and it stands for nitric oxide synthase. That's the name of the general name of the enzyme. And there's a little letter in front of it, a little I, a little E, or a little N. And the little I stands for inducible, the little E stands for endothelial, and the little N stands for neuronal, right? So in the brain, we have all of them. Actually, we have all of them. But one of the most important things that we know happens with nitric oxide in the brain is that when NNOS is stimulated, it actually signals to the neurons that the chemical that was released between brain cells, between neurons into the synapse, has made it across. So in the brain, we've got so many different connections, and these connections are called synapses, and these synapses have a space between them. So it's not like there's this continuous network where something can flow down like a hose, right? It's not like my brain is full of a bunch of tubes that just transmit stuff via almost like a hose-like effect to other parts of the brain or to other parts of the body. And instead, there are these neurons that are kind of like hoses, right? That they carry stuff, but they never interact. So it's like a bunch of short hoses that are almost touching, but you have to actually shoot water or a chemical, the chemical in this instance, right, from one neuron to another neuron, and so it has to be released from one neuron and picked up by the other. And so nitric oxide is very good at signaling to the releasing neuron that the neuron that needed to pick up the chemical has received it. And so, for example, the neuron that releases the chemical will release glutamate into this synapse, and then glutamate needs to go into the receiving neuron, and then once that happens, nitric oxide or neuronal nitric oxide synthase, the NNOS, does something called retrograde signaling. It will tell the releasing neuron, the presynaptic neuron, that the chemical was received, the message was received, and so that will change then how much glutamate or how much of the chemical is released. It might shut it down, it might lower it, it might trigger another nearby neuron to pick it up. So, I mean, there's a lot of different signaling that can happen. So in general, nitric oxide in the brain is with the neuronal nitric oxide, it's a signaling neuron. We do know that there's also a brain or a cardiovascular system in the brain, right? Blood flows everywhere. So there are arteries in the vein, and we want those just the same way as we want the arteries of the rest of our body. We want them to be the right size. When they're the right size, blood can flow easily where it needs to go. When they become constricted or the wrong size, too small, it changes the ability of blood to flow. It's harder for blood to flow where it needs to go. Sometimes those arteries can become completely blocked off, and that in the heart would be called a heart attack. In the brain, we call that a stroke. Anywhere, other places in the body, we call it a blood clot. And so it can get blocked off. And nitric oxide has a cardiovascular component in the brain. So we'll talk about the cardiovascular system here in a little bit, but just make note, when I talk about the cardiovascular system, it applies to blood vessels everywhere. So it'll apply to what the blood vessels that are in the brain too. And then the final form of NOS, nitric oxide synthase, is called inducible. Inducible just means something needs to stimulate it. And it, out of all of the NOSes, is considered quote unquote the bad one. I don't love those terms good and bad. I do believe that everything just has to be in balance, because if we couldn't make inducible NOS, then we would be overrun with infection. But that being said, when you have excessive iNOS producing excessive form of nitric oxide in the brain, that has been linked to issues with the blood-brain barrier. We do know that there's nitric oxide signaling when it is off, or when it's dysfunctional in the brain. We see that in certain neurodegenerative conditions. So we know that healthy nitric oxide levels play a role in the prevention of Parkinson's, the prevention of Alzheimer's disease. And so it is a molecule that's being researched extensively as a preventative, if you will, for neurodegenerative conditions. So nitric oxide in the brain, super, super important. So let's go on though. I do want to talk about it in the cardiovascular system, because remember, in the cardiovascular system, it goes everywhere, right? The blood is way more than even I recognize, right? There's so much that is transmitted in the blood. So sure, in the blood, we have red blood cells, right? These tiny little disc-like cells that I was taught back in high school, college biology classes, that these red blood cells carried oxygen to my cells. And I also knew that the blood carried nutrients, it carries cholesterol, but I was never really, I don't know. I just didn't dive deeper than that. I didn't even think very much about the cardiovascular system beyond that. And so while all of those are true, there's also actually an electromagnetic component to it, a quantum component, if you will, to blood flow. And the nitric oxide production in the blood vessels actually responds to this quote unquote quantum component of the blood. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into what that means. In general, we do know that eNOS is the main enzyme in the blood vessels that will help to produce nitric oxide. So eNOS is found in the cells that line the blood vessels, called the endothelium, and it's found actually on the surface of the red blood cells themselves, which is interesting because excessive nitric oxide production on a red blood cell is actually damaging to the red blood cell. So why would a red blood cell have the ability to make nitric oxide if that was damaging? And it has to do actually the fact that this NOS enzyme does two different things in the bloodstream that help your body sense exactly how well the blood is flowing, and it can adjust so quickly to improve blood flow. So this has implications in blood pressure. So anyone with hypertension, both pulmonary and just general hypertension, can benefit from understanding nitric oxide. This also then can play a role in anything related to cardiovascular disease, from our atherosclerosis, even high cholesterol. And if you're dealing with any cardiovascular related issues, you're going to want to understand nitric oxide and its, I guess, the dual role of NOS in the cardiovascular system. There's an image that I'm showing on the screen right now, and what you're looking at is a slice through of a capillary, or pretty much any blood vessel. And so this is called a cross section, meaning it's like you took a hose and you cut it in half and you're looking into the hose. And what you see is basically this tube that looks like it's lined with fur or shag carpet, something along those lines. That fur, that shag carpet, it's called the Glycocalyx, and it is so, so important for the health of blood flow and the way that we can make sure that red blood cells and things are able to move through the bloodstream instead of getting stuck. Anytime something gets stuck, it can create damage. It can create a plaque. It can create a blockage. It can create major, major issues that are very much life-threatening. They can be life-threatening. So we want our blood to flow. why is this little furry glycocalyx, it's not really fur, but it looks like fur. Why is this glycocalyx so important? So what this part of the blood vessel has, this lining of the blood vessel has, is the glycocalyx, and the glycocalyx can build up exclusion zone water. I got a slide a little bit further that also show this in a different way, just to kind of highlight it. But what we see here is that exclusion zone water will actually then line the blood vessels. Why is that important? Well, what we know about exclusion zone water is it has a texture that's slick, right? It's got like a texture almost like, oh, I don't know, maple syrup, or not necessarily a texture, but it's like a coating, right? It's a coating of maple syrup. It's a coating of Jello, if you will, around the blood vessels, and it has a negative charge. Charge is very important. And so basically this glycocalyx builds up this exclusion zone of negative charge around the interior of the blood vessel. It's a hose tube, and the inner lining of the hose tube has this negative charge built up. And so the buildup of this negative charge is super important, and we'll find out why. Now, I do want to highlight that a lot of this information that I've gotten is from Dr. Stephanie Seneff. She is brilliant, an amazing scientist and researcher, for those who don't know, who ties so many bigger pictures together. And I just want to highlight how grateful I am for her and her brain and her dissemination of this amazing information. So this figure comes from one of her papers right here. I'm going to show you for those, so for those of you who can see the paper, you'll see, but basically what this looks like is, instead of cutting a hose in half and looking down into the hose, I've actually sliced it the long way. And so I'm still looking at the inside of the blood vessel, but instead of looking at it from the circle in, I've taken that hose and I've sliced it down the long way. So I see just the curve of one wall. And on the curve of that one wall, you'll see that there's this negative charge that builds up. This negative charge builds up because the glycocalyx is full of something called glycosaminoglycans and sulfate. Just think of that as just molecules that are really, really good at building up this exclusion gel and keeping the inside of the blood vessels. This happens to be a capillary, keeps the insides of the capillary nice and gooey, if you will, so that things can't stick. Just as a side note, let's talk, because maybe we don't all understand this, right? But blood always goes from bigger tubes to smaller tubes to tiny little capillaries to then again medium-sized tubes to bigger tubes. On one side, you've got the blood that actually has oxygen in it, and those are called the arteries, or the arterial system. So essentially, the reason we breathe oxygen is to send that oxygen to our mitochondria so our mitochondria can make energy. And we need to carry that oxygen. That oxygen doesn't just necessarily diffuse through the blood. It has to go onto a carrier molecule. And that carrier molecule is on the red blood cell. It's called hemoglobin. So hemoglobin, just picture that as like a little chair that sits on the red blood cells, and it buckles up some oxygen, and it carries that oxygen wherever the mitochondria in the body need it. And so the arteries go from the heart, right? Big branches of the heart to medium-sized branches to very, very tiny little branches, kind of like a tree in reverse, right? From like a big trunk to as the branches go up to the sky, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. Same thing with the cardiovascular system. The arteries start big and they get really, really tiny. And by the time the red blood cells reach the capillaries, these capillaries are so tiny that red blood cells are actually bigger than the size of the capillary itself. So how can we get this big red blood cell through the capillary? Well, number one, we want this red blood cell to be kind of squishy itself. We don't want it to have a super stiff membrane. And number two, we want to make sure that there's a lot of ooey gooey exclusion zone gel water in the capillary tube itself so that this red blood cell can pass frictionless, essentially, through the tube, where then it'll go to the venous system, the veins, and it'll go to the small veins, the medium-sized veins, all the way up to the big veins and back to the heart, or I'm sorry, back to the lungs where it's going to pick up oxygen. And so that's just kind of the circular aspect of circulation. And so I just wanted everyone to understand, it's very important though, that we get these red blood cells that were full of oxygen. They're full of negative charge. They're full of nutrients and things. We get these red blood cells where they need to go to distribute all this stuff. And then we actually have to get them back to reload this stuff up. So it's a very important pathway. They have to be able to get through these capillaries. So nature was amazing, right? And Dr. Senath has highlighted this in some really amazing papers. But what we see is that these capillaries and the entire vascular system is lined with this exclusion zone water that's really gooey. The cool part too is that the red blood cells themselves have a lot of things on the surface of them that makes negative charge. They've got cholesterol sulfate, which is the one that I want to highlight most. But in and of themselves, they're going to build negative charge. But the amount of cholesterol sulfate or sulfated cholesterol is how I'm going to refer to it, as the amount of sulfated cholesterol they have will create an even bigger exclusion zone of negative charge around them. And so why is this important? Well, negative charges repel. And so when negative charges repel, it means that there's less likely to be stickiness happening. We see, picture two ends of a magnet, right? Both the negative ends of magnets. What happens when you try to bring two magnets close to each other, to both the negative ends of the magnet? They repel. You try as hard as you can to put those ends together, but they will not touch. They're going to repel away from each other. That same thing happens with our red blood cells and the inner lining of our vasculature, our cardiovascular system. We want that negative charge because that negative charge means that the red blood cells are repelling away from each other. The red blood cells aren't necessarily going to touch and clump together. That's good because we don't want clots. And then the red blood cells aren't going to bump in and stick to the walls of the arteries. That's good because we don't want a heart attack or a stroke. And they're not going to even stick into the capillaries. Even as tiny as those capillaries are, they're not going to stick. And part of that's because of this negative charge of the tube itself that just kind of allows this red blood cell to slip right on through. The other part about that is that the arterial system is more negatively charged than the veins. So you'll see the negative charge on this diagram. That would be the arterial system. And then the veins are kind of actually a positive charge, negative and positive, that'll attract, right? So if there's a slightly negatively charged red blood cell, the venous system doesn't have as much negative charge. So it's going to actually attract that red blood cell, kind of suck it through. And that's what happens. I think this is really important to understand. And so we need this negative charge built up in our body, built up in our blood vessels. And I want to also talk about how this ties to nitric oxide. So actually, oopsies, I went ahead. So what nitric oxide is made not only on the red blood cell, eNOS, endothelial nitric oxide, is not only made on the red blood cell itself, but it's also made inside of the endothelium. So the lining of the blood vessels also makes nitric oxide, which is cool because nitric oxide causes a blood vessel to get bigger. It causes vasodilation, or the enlargement, the dilation of a blood vessel. So that allows blood to flow more easily through the body. The body is always looking to have blood flow more easily through it. And so in response to certain stimuli, that nitric oxide is produced. So what are those stimuli? Well, we're going to talk about sunlight in a second, but I wanted actually to highlight the quantum aspect of this. And this is the work that I found very fascinating. I believe the researcher's name is Trevelli, who really started to highlight this. But what you have with this red blood cell, a red blood cell is a moving negative charge, right? It's just like this negative charged ball, and it's moving. It's being moved and pumped and repelled through the circulatory system. In quantum physics, quantum biology, anything that is charged and moving generates both a magnetic field and then by definition also an electrical field. So an electromagnetic field, it generates its own waves, right? Its own signal, electromagnetic wave signal. And we know now that the eNOS that is lining the blood vessels, this enzyme that's lining the blood vessels, can actually translate that electromagnetic signal and respond by saying, well, I can sense how this blood cell, this red blood cell, is moving right now. And I can tell it's either moving freely and easily, so I'm going to keep the blood vessels the same size, or its movement is really restricted. It feels like its movement is experiencing a lot of friction. And so I'm going to make more nitric oxide to dilate the blood vessel in order for the red blood cells to move more freely through the bloodstream. It's so cool, right? So it's actually the signature electromagnetic field that's being generated by each and every red blood cell that helps this process happen. There's other things as well. And we don't want this process to go awry, because when nitric oxide cannot be made, then we cannot necessarily dilate our blood vessels. And when we can't dilate our blood vessels, that's hypertension, that's high blood pressure, that's increased risk for stroke, heart attack, all sorts of things like that. And also in the brain, then we know it can be an increased risk for cognitive impairment, neurodegenerative diseases. So we have got nature gave us so many mechanisms to help improve our ability to make nitric oxide in the bloodstream, right? Because getting blood where it needs to go is very important. So one of the ways that I like to talk about is getting sunlight exposure on the skin. A specific wavelength of sunlight called ultraviolet A, or UVA sunlight. When it interacts with the skin, it causes a whole cascade of things to happen. But the downstream effect is the fact that nitric oxide is produced. So nitric oxide gets produced in the skin, but then it also gets produced in the blood vessels and carried from the blood vessels, then causing the blood vessels to respond and vasodilate or get bigger. So when people are dealing with high blood pressure, I always think of high blood pressure as a potential for sunlight deficiency, a potential for exclusion zone water deficiency, issues with the type of electromagnetic fields we are putting ourselves in, because we want the body to really just read the electromagnetic field of the moving blood, the moving red blood cells. So just being aware of all of those things is very important. But I think a low-hanging fruit on this is getting outside as much as possible when UVA is present. Very interesting that we do see a seasonal change in blood pressure. I have clients who have higher blood pressure measured in the winter versus measured in the summer. That has to do with the fact that in the summer, oftentimes they're out golfing all day, and they're doing yard work, and they're outside a ton. They're playing with their grandkids at the beach, whatever it might be. And so their blood pressure goes down. While in the winter, when in Michigan, we're stuck. Oh, I personally don't want to be, I'm not stuck inside, but a lot of us don't like the cold, right? We don't want to go outside in winter. And also there's not a ton of UVA light present then. So we might not be able to get the blood pressure lowering effects in the winter in the same way. And so I do see a distinct change in blood pressure. I also have found it very interesting that I've had several clients either lower or completely get off of their blood pressure medication based on both increasing their UVA exposure outside, but also then combining that with sauna therapy, the red light and infrared therapy with that. I'm not going to touch a ton on that, but we do know that infrared light exposure can also help stimulate nitric oxide production and help with blood flow. So that's pretty awesome. I think that one has more to do also with infrared's ability to build exclusion zone water. So we make the inside lining of the blood vessel as well as the outside of the red blood cells very slick so that it can move more frictionless through the system. Okay, so let's talk about that exclusion zone water for one last second, because it's one of my favorite things. But here's another way to look at it. We see this tube. And on this tube, we see negative charge, the EZ, the exclusion zones lining the tube. And then you've got the bulk water, what would be considered the liquid blood, right? Form of the blood that's just moving and carrying things through the bloodstream. And so I want to make note that the other thing about sunlight that's important to highlight is that sunlight on the skin will help us to sulfate cholesterol. And if you recall, those red blood cells, all of them had cholesterol sticking out of them. Lots of our cells actually have cholesterol sticking out of them. And if we can sulfate our cholesterol by ultraviolet light striking the skin can help us to sulfate our cholesterol. It also sulfates vitamin D. It sulfates a heck of a lot of things actually. So because sulfur is very important in the body, the sulfate on the outside of our cells is very important. And one of the proposed mechanisms as to why it's so important is because it is really, really good at building that exclusion zone water. And so therefore very good at building that negative charge surrounding the outside of things. And so sunlight, besides just helping to stimulate the release of nitric oxide itself, it also sulfates things and helps to build that exclusion zone charge so that we have the repulsion of the red blood cells throughout the bloodstream. But we also build that negative charge around all of our cells. So very, very important. I just wanted to give an image for those of you. I've done several Instagram posts this past week on nitric oxide. And so I wanted to give an image that I found that shows the difference between what's called ungrounded blood and grounded blood. And this actually just shows what happens when blood cells, red blood cells, are loaded with that beautiful negative charge, which generally means they've got a high exclusion zone, lots of sulfated cholesterol, and a high zeta potential. That's just another word for a high negative charge around them. So you'll see in the one image that the blood looks like it's just clumped together. It's like these red blood cells are like discs, almost like donuts, right? That are literally just stacked and clumped together. When this subject in this particular experiment was exposed to, I believe this was 20 minutes of grounding, but I have seen research showing anywhere between 20 minutes to 45 minutes of grounding. You will see the red blood cells all of a sudden start to separate, and they'll repel each other. They're not able to stick and clump together anymore. So instead of stacking up and being way more likely to clump and make way more likely to cause issues in the cardiovascular system, they're actually bouncing off of each other and moving beautifully and freely through the blood vessels. It's a really cool thing to see. And so this highlights another one of my things, and it's be barefoot outside as much as possible, because it does so many things. If being barefoot, if being grounded can do this, it'll help you build this easy charge, this zeta potential, this good beneficial charge around the blood cells. Imagine combining being grounded in sunlight the way we've been intended to be for millions and millions of years. So just being so disconnected from grounding and so disconnected from the sun is a reason why we're having so many of the health challenges that we have these days. And it's not necessarily about doing anything fancy or expensive. It's literally making your environment more natural. Being outside barefoot under the sun as much as you possibly can. It can make a huge difference. And I like to highlight little things like this to be able to see exactly what happens in real time as the body becomes more grounded, more full of that negative charge, that easy water. Super beneficial for the cardiovascular system. Okay, let's move on. I just want to touch briefly on nitric oxide in the immune system. This is very important, and I'm going to highlight how this ties actually to nasal breathing, in my opinion. So what I'm showing is an image of a macrophage, which is just a specific type of immune cell. And these macrophages, when they get the signal, they will literally release hundreds, if not thousands of times more nitric oxide than you'll get produced by eNOS in the blood vessels. The blood vessels want just the right amount of nitric oxide. When you get a whole heck of a lot of nitric oxide, a huge release of targeted nitric oxide to an area, it is cytotoxic. And that's a good thing for the immune system, because what these macrophages do, these immune cells, is that when they get the signal that there is a pathogenic bacteria in the body, the macrophages will literally find that bacteria and they will release a ton of nitric oxide, and that nitric oxide will kill the bacteria. So that's very, very important. We want not only the macrophages to be able to sense that and do that, but they need to be getting the right signal. But what happens, unfortunately, is that they can get either the wrong signal or just a chronic signal. This should be a very short, acute thing that happens. This shouldn't be happening all 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for years and years and years on end. So when we overproduce this is part of the inducible nitric oxide production, right? It's being induced by a specific signal, oftentimes a signal sent by the immune system. Side note, let's just remember that immune and inflammation are the same. The immune system creates inflammation. And that inflammation, if it's acute, can be beneficial. If it's chronic, it can really start to drive disease. So oftentimes we get confused that it's our immune system that's responsible, or partially, for the level of inflammation that's in the body. So some of the signals that these macrophages can respond to are things like the production of cytokines, or inflammatory markers such as TNF alpha. I want to highlight TNF alpha because of the fact that yes, bacteria, or the coatings of bacteria, those sorts of things can drive up TNF alpha, this inflammatory chemical. But there's a lot of research showing that the types of foods we eat can also drive up TNF alpha, which can create issues if nitric oxide is overproduced in the gut. And so just making note that an inflammatory lifestyle, or doing things that drive up these inflammatory markers, can really dysregulate our immune system and be a perpetuator of chronic inflammation. And so being aware of the types of things we're exposed to. A specific study, I don't want to necessarily name the name, but there was a drive-through restaurant that created these little muffins that contained sausage, egg, and cheese. And the research studied what happens after these participants ate this specific breakfast sandwich, and specifically looking at TNF alpha. And it was found that this TNF alpha was elevated in these subjects for up to 4 hours after the consumption of this breakfast sandwich. So that just goes to show you that that's the immune system saying, okay, something's going on. We gotta take care of this. There's an inflammatory marker going on. We gotta find the source of this. And when that source is continuous, things can go wrong, and you can get a ton of inflammation that just lasts. But we do want this to happen in short term. So let's say we're exposed to a bacterium or a virus or something along those lines that could cause symptoms in the body. We want the body to the immune cells to be able to release a huge dose of nitric oxide to kill these bacteria, invading bacteria or invading viruses. This, although, can go awry if we have a chronic infection. So a lot of times I see connections between autoimmune conditions and what's called dysbiosis somewhere in the body. And dysbiosis is just an imbalance of what would be the natural bacteria that want to live in an area of the body. Remember, we're full of bacteria. But if we happen to have an imbalance that the immune system recognizes as not good for us, we'll get this chronic immune response, chronic inflammatory response, and we can get just this excessive inducible nitric oxide production, which can ultimately damage tissue. And so part of that tissue damage could be autoimmunity. So just be aware if ever you are someone who feels like you have chronic infections going on. It is an important thing to clear up in order to be able to get rid of that inducible nitric oxide chronic overproduction. Here's where, though, inducible nitric oxide or nitric oxide production can be very beneficial to help protect us from bacterial infection, if you will. And so we can make a ton of nitric oxide in our nose. So nasal breathing is key. Nasal breathing, we've talked about we've heard about the nose breathing as a filter for pathogenic microorganisms, because it can touch the cilia, the little hairs that line the nose, and the mucus that lines those membranes, and it'll physically trap those bacteria, and we can get rid of it. That's part of it. But I think also part of it is the fact that through nose breathing, we can get a really, really large production of nitric oxide. And that nitric oxide can help to kill bacteria that we inhale. If we inhale those bacteria through our nose, we've got an immediate route in which we can start to kill them. And that's through the increase of nitric oxide. We also know that nitric oxide if we're producing enough nitric oxide, or I'll say the right amount of nitric oxide, we're also less likely to see things like allergies, asthma, sinus infections, stuff like that. So nitric oxide production in the nose is very important. One really great way to produce nitric oxide through the nose is something called Brahmari breathing, which is I believe it's Ayurvedic. And what that does is you basically just breathe and you hum. And when you hum, that humming, that vibration kind of in the back of the throat, back of the sinuses can generate up to 15 times more nitric oxide than you would if you were just breathing normally. So let's just make note, breathing through the mouth generates almost zero nitric oxide. Breathing naturally through the nose will generate some nitric oxide. But if we want an increased production of nitric oxide, we can actually breathe through the nose and then hum. And then doing that for about 5 minutes can really increase the amount of nitric oxide. So I'm going to look like a weirdo right now, but I'm going to show you what that looks like. Is just a natural full inhale through the nose. And then I'm going to literally hum. And if I plug my ears and even close my eyes while I do it, I'm going to feel this crazy vibration effect. And it's that vibration effect that it's called humming bee breathing that will help to stimulate this nitric oxide production. So it's like, and creating just this major vibration happening. I don't close my eyes while I'm driving, but I will do this while I'm driving in the car by myself at a red light or something. You know, I'll just do some of this humming bee breathing. Who knows if that's doing anything for me, but I do believe that it helps to it helps my body just regulate nitric oxide and those pathways that make nitric oxide. So an interesting way, if you want to try something to do a short-term high boost of nitric oxide in the body, that would be one of the ways in which you can do it. Okay, so then what I'm showing is this space. We're in the mitochondria now. We are in the mitochondria. I have said that nitric oxide is impactful in the mitochondria. So how does that happen? Well, nitric oxide can actually slow down the production of ATP. And so that can be good and bad. So nitric oxide is sometimes the body's always looking to optimize things, right? It's not necessarily that more is always better or less is always bad. We want just the right amount. So we want each mitochondrion to make just the right amount of ATP and water that our cells need at any given time. What we see happens though is when in response to what's called excessive intracellular calcium. So when the cell pulls in a bunch of calcium, this stimulates the production of nitric oxide in the cell. And this nitric oxide will bind to part of the electron transport chain where we start to, where the series of steps where we take electrons and we make ATP. Nitric oxide will bind to something called complex 4 or cytochrome C oxidase of the mitochondrial electron transport chain, and it will inhibit that step. So all of a sudden electrons are bouncing, boom, 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 and they got to get to this thing called the ATPase, and the ATPase is where ATP is made. But once they get to step 3, they can't get to step 4 if nitric oxide is bound. When nitric oxide is bound, you basically get a backlog of what happens on the previous 3 steps. And the previous 3 steps, especially complex 3, I believe, make something called superoxide, like an oxygen-free radical. Crazy reactive oxygen-free radical. And if there's enough superoxide that builds up and enough nitric oxide that builds up, you get the formation of something called peroxynitrite, or oh no, if you're looking at this image, it's the oh no negative. And so oh no if it builds up, it will cause massive tissue damage. So we want enough nitric oxide to be available in case we need to slow down the production of energy, or need to kind of optimize the production of energy. But if nitric oxide is basically permanently interacting with complex 4, you're going to get a backlog of superoxide. You're not going to be making ATP. And if you get a backlog of superoxide with lots of nitric oxide, you are going to be making peroxynitrite, which depending on what tissue it's in, it can cause massive damage, drive up inflammation, create more inducible nitric oxide, like you name it, it creates this vicious cycle of damage and dysfunction. So how does that happen, or why does that happen? Or my opinion actually is that nitric oxide's there. It does, like I said, it happens with this influx of calcium into the cell. So what drives this flux of calcium into the cell? That goes to some of the research that's been done and put out there that I've heard from Dr. Neil Nathan with the cell danger response, also with Dr. Martin Paul with what happens when we're exposed to excessive non-native electromagnetic fields, so non-native EMFs, which are things like cell phone radiation and Wi-Fi. When we reach a certain exposure or a certain threshold of these things, the cell basically gets flooded with calcium. And when it reaches a certain threshold, that stimulates the production of nitric oxide. And this nitric oxide then it's a signaling molecule, so we want it, right? We want it. It's like the cell waving and saying, wait a second, something's going on. I need repair. I need help. Sometimes this can go on to stimulate apoptosis and autophagy. There's a lot of mixed research about the exact pathway. So part of it might be that it helps to tell the cell, hey, danger, danger. You either have to put me through programmed cell death called apoptosis, or you have to massively repair me called autophagy. So it might be stimulating those pathways. We're not exactly sure. But what we do know is that if NO, nitric oxide, is permanently bound or bound for an extended period of time to complex 4 in this respiratory chain, then we can have issues. We can get the buildup of this peroxynitrite. So what causes, or what can we do about this? Well, number one, we can get ourselves away from excessive non-native electromagnetic fields. We can hardwire as much stuff in our house as possible. We can put our cell phone on airplane mode at night. We can not sleep with it. The number of college students that I've lectured who have told me that they literally have their cell phone next to their head at night because they just fall asleep like this. It makes me nervous. But that being said, there are things we can do, right? We can distance ourselves from anything that's emitting electromagnetic radiation. The more distance we can put ourselves between the emitter and us, the less biological impact it will have on us. So the less calcium signaling that we may have. It's just called the inverse square law. We just got to create distance. So if you have your Wi-Fi router on your desk, right behind your head, or right next to you at your office, and you're literally right in front of the Wi-Fi signal, perhaps you take that router and you move it at a further distance away from you so that you establish some space between yourself and the source of radiation. Or better yet, you use these cords, right? I don't know if I can show you, but I've got all my stuff hardwired, right? No, but I've got my stuff hardwired. So you can hardwire and use old school Ethernet as well. Okay, so that's what happens here. So what can we do about it besides avoiding the things that stimulate the calcium influx? Oh, along with that calcium influx, I have found that mold exposure, chronic mold exposure, and chronic mycotoxins can also be a big driver of this. So if you have lived in a water damaged building, if you've been exposed to mold, if mold is an issue for you, again, this is a process that could be happening in your mitochondria and leading to mitochondrial dysfunction plus tissue damage. So cool news, though, is that we know that red light frequencies specifically, but also near infrared A. So red light and near infrared A light, specific frequencies of sunlight, will kick nitric oxide off of complex 4. It'll give it the boot. It'll say, get off. And when it boots nitric oxide from complex 4, oxygen can then continue to flow through the chain, and everything can flow through the chain along with the electrons, and you can get the production of water and ATP, both of which, as you know, as a lot of you know who follow me on Instagram, it's not just about ATP production. We got to produce that water. That biological water is so, so key. So we want both of these steps to be optimized. We want the ATP production. We want the biological water to be produced as well. All right, so what does that mean? It means get out into natural sunlight. Red light and near infrared A are always present in sunlight. So anytime you can get, and that wavelength of sun actually penetrates through the skin into the body pretty deeply. It can go up to 30 centimeters. So you put yourself in natural light, you're exposing essentially all of your mitochondria to this beautiful healing frequency that can then displace nitric oxide, and allow your mitochondria to optimize their function. You also, if you're out there, you're making more exclusion zone water in the mitochondria, which with part of mitochondrial dysfunction is these mitochondria swell up. And when they swell, they can't pass electrons through their chain. They literally can't tunnel these electrons. The electrons can't flow from one step to the next. But that exclusion zone water can help. It's a denser, right? It's denser. So it'll help to bring the mitochondria back to its appropriate size so that those electrons can tunnel. Lots of things, beneficial things that happen when we are exposed in sunlight. Side note, get as naked as possible as you can in the sun. I mean, that's kind of how we were designed, right? So, and the number of people have told me that they've never ever been naked in the sun. Gosh, it's not like I'm a nudist in my backyard at all, but I've got this swimsuit called a kaniki. It's basically a swimsuit. They make bikinis. They also make one pieces, tankinis. They make stuff for, men, women, whatever. They make it for everybody. but you can, they have like thousands of little tiny holes in them that provide coverage so that you don't look naked outside. You're wearing something, but the sunlight can penetrate. And so if you don't want to just get naked in the sun, put on a kaniki or something along those lines that lets the light through so that you can get light to all of your mitochondria. Okay, I guess that was my spiel on nitric oxide. I hope you understand the importance of it in several different areas. But I think the 2% takeaways are that in certain instances, we want it to be optimized. In other areas, we don't, right? We want to make it, we want to bring it down. So ways that we want it optimized, we want to be able to produce nitric oxide in our skin. We want to be able to produce nitric in our skin via the sunlight exposure. We want to be able to make nitric oxide in our blood vessels to help blood flow through the cardiovascular system, helps with the brain. We want to make sure that in order to do that, we want to make it through our airways as well, right? We want to be able to breathe in through our nose and make nitric oxide. So some 2% takeaways that are pretty simple are always breathe through your nose, day and night. Only if you are doing super intense exercise should you be breathing through your mouth. And then at which point, when you recover, start breathing through your nose as much as possible. That's very, very important. So nasal breathing is key. You can do that humming bee breath, that Brahmari breathing with the humming, right? That can be very beneficial in giving you short boosts of nitric oxide. Something that I didn't mention is that another path that we make nitric oxide is the bacteria on our tongue that kind of live in the crypts and folds of our tongue can take something called dietary nitrates and ultimately make them into nitric oxide, again, to get more nitric oxide into our system. And one thing that diminishes that is antiseptic mouthwash. So I don't want to name names, but if you're a regular user of antiseptic mouthwash, that can actually kill those bacteria that make beneficial nitric oxide for us. And so what are foods that can ultimately become nitric oxide for us? Well, you got both plant foods that have the nitrates in them, and then you've got other foods that have arginine in them. Both nitrate and arginine in different ways that I'm not going to go into can become nitric oxide. So nitrate-rich foods are things like the two that I want to highlight with that are beets and greens. Make sure they are organic, because the enzyme eNOS that helps to convert, or probably all the NOS enzymes, frankly, that are used to make nitric oxide can be damaged extensively by glyphosate, Roundup, weed killer, right? Pesticide. So you want to make sure you're consuming in produce form, you're consuming the vegetables and the fruits, nuts and seeds as close to organic as possible, because glyphosate is pervasive and it's extremely damaging to the body. Dr. Seneff, who I highlighted earlier, has just released a book called Toxic Legacy that is brilliant if you want to understand this. It's phenomenal. Okay, so you can consume greens and you can consume beets or beet powder. Dr. Thomas Cowan, he's got a company called Dr. Cowan's Gardens. I might put links to this stuff below. I'm new to this podcasting stuff, especially on YouTube. So I guess I can put links below. I don't have affiliations with any of these things, just stuff that I've used. But they make an organic red beet powder that I do like. I think that you could consume that regularly if you want to get a little boost of nitric oxide production, especially prior to a workout or anytime you just want your blood to flow a little bit better. So chew your food. Chewing food is key. Again, a low-hanging fruit, chew your food 20 to 30 times. Allow the enzymes and the bacteria in your mouth to do their job. So if there's bacteria in our mouth that can help us make nitric oxide, they have to come in contact with the nitrates, which means we have to chew it well enough for that to happen. So chew your food, please. Exercise, we know that the movement of blood, one of the things that's sensed is that electromagnetic signal will sense that when blood is moving faster, when our heart is pumping more, the electromagnetic signal on the red blood cells moving faster also will produce nitric oxide. So this is why we get a nitric oxide boost when we exercise. It's because those electromagnetic sensors in the eNOS sense that we need to move the blood faster. And so we want the blood vessels to be bigger so that we can push more blood in a faster way to help account for the increase in the activity that we're doing. UVA sunlight, I said before, get your skin under the sun, or as Dr. Jack Kruse says, get your skin in the game, right? Get your skin in the game. It's very important in order to be able to make nitric oxide through the skin. And because this happens with quantum effects, that means nonlinear. It's not like 20 minutes equals 200 units of nitric oxide. It's a nonlinear effect, which means that a little dose can go a long way. So lots of little doses throughout the day can really add up to a big impact. Hence where I talk about 2% takeaways. It doesn't have to be, okay, I'm going to build a hut and live outside all day long, although that would be pretty cool. But you do need to get these regular little 2% exposures of all of these things in order to be able to yield a pretty big benefit. If you are exposed to a lot of things that increase intracellular calcium, chronic infections that needs to get taken care of, mold exposure, clean up a moldy home, get the mycotoxins out of the body, easier said than done. I am very aware of that, but just FYI that that's a component of this. And then things, trying to not surround yourself with the artificial, the non-native electromagnetic fields like Wi-Fi and cell phone radiation, and instead surround yourself with the very beneficial electromagnetic fields that come from the surface of the earth via grounding, come from the sunlight onto our skin, which, as we saw happens with those red blood cells, they become super healthy and they can flow beautifully through the body, through the blood vessels. And that sunlight can kick bound nitric oxide off of complex 4 in the mitochondria, so we can start to make way better energy and more of that beautiful biological water that can get structured into its exclusion zone form and be this beautiful liquid crystal throughout our entire system. So okay, well, I hope this was helpful in some way, shape, or form. I do want to say thank you for watching. If you have any comments or questions and want to get a hold of me on Instagram, DM me, Carrie B Wellness. Leave a comment below. Let me know if you have any questions here. And yeah, thanks for listening. And I guess we'll just talk next time. Bye.